pleasure to be here on this summer's evening. And as ever, I'm sure we've people from Ireland, the UK, and much further afield join us. I was delighted to hear that Dr. Sinead Rhodes was booked in by Beth and colleagues for this evening's session. And of course, as always, we're joined by Ken Kilbride and Valerie Andrews of ADHD Ireland. But Sinead, in terms of her background, I know Dr. Rhodes is a developmental psychologist who's interested in cognitive factors underlying behavior and learning. And her research principally focuses on cognition, especially memory and associated executive functions in children with neurodevelopmental disorders, including ADHD, autism, and dyspraxia. Sinead also examines cognitive factors underlying mental health, especially depression and anxiety, and is particularly interested in cognition and depression within the context of neurodevelopmental disorders. Sinead is extensively involved in engagement and involvement approaches to research and is the director of the University of Edinburgh spin-out social enterprise company, Epic Think Learn. The community interest company offers services and resources to parents and teachers of neurodivergent children, including those on waiting lists. They are also a clinician trainer provider. And I guess very briefly, one of the things that really attracted me to Sinead's work, I was just looking at various university websites, looking around ADHD in particular, and I came across the EPIC program in Edinburgh. And, you know, for me, I'm not a school teacher. I don't have that area of expertise, but I was totally taken aback by the breadth and the extent of the program, by the evidence base underpinning it. And I simply formed a view that it was a program that deserved to be disseminated widely, and I would hope implemented internationally. So as I say at the outset, when I heard that Beth had taken the opportunity to book in Sinead, I was really pleased because I think you're going to enjoy her talk. If I don't stay for the full talk this evening, please forgive me. I'm a little bit hoarse, but I'll hand you over to Sinead now, and I hope you have a lovely session. Thank you.
Okay, it's lovely to be here this evening. And as described, I'm going to talk about the research, but also how I've translated this research so as to engage families, teachers, and practitioners who work with neurodivergent young people. So you can see from this word cloud, lots of different conditions here. I tend to now use the term neurodivergent. There's lots of different reasons for this. But one of them is that children in the UK, and I know it's similar in Ireland, are on very long waiting lists for assessment. We also know these conditions are highly co-occurring, so you might receive a diagnosis of one and then you're waiting for another. And actually, we've done a lot of research, particularly with children with ADHD on waiting lists, and then followed them up over time. And in the UK, it's 3 to 4 years for assessment, depending, on your location. It's a very, very long time. But children are accepted onto it, or not, fairly quickly. Within a few months. It's called the NHS Choice Appointment. And actually, our research has shown, because we've assessed children at this point, that in terms of their functional needs, it doesn't matter whether they go on to get a diagnosis or not. Obviously, a diagnosis is really important for identity issues, for medication, but actually we know that all children who are accepted onto these waiting lists have cognitive learning well-being needs. So that's been very clear from the research. If we look across these conditions, and again, one of the reasons why I refer to neurodivergent children increasingly rather than condition-specific is I do research across a lot of conditions, but if we look at, for example, some of the most common, ADHD, autism, dyspraxia, we see the same developmental outcomes. So we know that individuals who are neurodivergent in terms of their education, and this is an English study that I'm going to describe, achieve on average 2 GCSEs compared to their peers who achieve 7. And we know that occupational attainment is very low. And in one recent study, this was focused on autistic young people. 22% secured employment, while for the peers it was 75%. And then mental health, and this is, I think, one of the most concerning aspects across those conditions. So whether you have ADHD, dyspraxia, or autism, or a combination, which is the most common, we see much greater prevalence of mental health difficulties, particularly depression and anxiety. And what's really striking about this is that the onset is generally as a child in primary school, in middle childhood, which is a very different picture than the general population. I was going to say that's across these conditions. So increasingly, I refer to neurodivergent and I conduct research across these conditions because we're seeing a lot of similarities. Historically, if we look at ways in which we have supported these conditions, they were done often, separately. So you had programs for autism and so on. And historically, certainly when I came into research, my very first research study, by the way, was in UCD, about 27, 28 years ago. But when I came into research, programs that were to support these were children were focused on fixing them. We spoke about deficits and impairments and identifying what was wrong with the child to try and fix them. The neurodiversity approach has really moved away from that, and the EPIC approach really moves away from that. And if you look to the right, what we're doing is always looking at the environment. What ways in which can we manage the environment to make it more acceptable for a young neurodivergent person? And we look at the task. And if you even just say the term task to someone with ADHD, it's very off-putting. But what ways can we, adapt the task? Does it have to be done pen and paper? Does it have to be done on a laptop? What are the ways that we can do these in a way that's more optimal to their needs and to their interests and to their motivation? With EPIC, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So we're still very much looking at the child and helping them to identify not just their difficulties, but also their strengths. So we take a strengths and difficulties approach where we embrace some of their characteristics, which can be a strength. And we also look at identifying their difficulties as an opportunity. So it's not something negative to be fixed, but it's an opportunity to better understand and support them, with the child and adult working together. And that's really, really important. The child is very much a part of identifying, what the outcomes, what their goals are. As we mentioned, I do a lot of involvement work, and this work has been co-produced, not just with the adults, but also with children. And so you see on the left-hand side, a paper we published a couple of years back, where we listened to the voice of children before we suggested strategies that we thought would be useful, that we know from the cognitive psychology literature is useful, but we actually went to children and their teachers. And we've developed a lot of resources, including we've got these free booklets online. I'm not sure if you can see me, but I'm holding up one of these booklets. So there's understanding booklets and there's strategy booklets. And they're on the Epic Think Learn website, free to download. And the approach that we took in terms of developing understanding and supports for children was very much from what the knowledge we have about these children. And that is there are differences between children with the same diagnosis. If you meet one autistic child, you've met one autistic child, and the same applies to others. Co-occurrence is the norm. I've published a number of systematic reviews in the last few years, one last year on the co-occurrence of autism and ADHD. And in high quality studies, we know it's 1 in 2. They might not receive a diagnosis for the second condition, but the symptoms are likely to still be there. It's also really important, because of the long waiting lists, and we know that we need to identify and support these children very early on. And the approach that we take, there's no need to separate children based on diagnosis, and indeed they don't need to have a diagnosis at all. So in this approach, it's very much child-led, and it's led around the child's interests and activities. So if the child has a special interest, we're really wanting to know about that. We're wanting to use that and use the games and activities that they like to engage in activities where they learn about how their memory works, how their attention works, how to plan something, self-regulation, timing. All the things are absolutely critical to being able to not just learn in school, but participate in class, have friends outside, engage, effectively in your family. And at some stage, we move on to learning tasks. And that, when I say learning tasks, I mean tasks at home, like being able to get out, of the house in time, as well as academic tasks, say in school. But it's very much about the children um, learning about how their thinking skills work in fun and ways that are meaningful to them, so that they feel upskilled and empowered to, do this and employ these strategies when they need to do so on more mundane or complex tasks. And really, with EPIC, we talk about changing the lens through which we see the child. Children who are neurodivergent, they often perceive themselves as difficult. They find everyday life difficult, and they often perceive that adults and people around them see them as difficult. And really, with the EPIC approach, it's about changing that lens, changing the lens through which you see the child. So you're not looking at behavior that needs to be fixed, not looking at hyperactivity and say, we need to stop this. We obviously need to manage it in the classroom or, those kind of situations. But it's about trying to understand it and working with the child to identify how can this work. We've done a lot of qualitative work with neurodivergent children, and the phrase that always comes out to me is when they say, I'm neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. So here now we want to see the world through, the way that they do, and see the difficulties they're encountering, and try and provide a supportive environment where they can excel, where they can be happy. So it's really this approach. The P in psychoeducation, in EPIC for psychoeducation, is really important. It's about empowering the child with an understanding of themselves. And then we can upskill them with a toolkit of strategies they can draw on. Often teachers will come to me and say, talk about strategies first. The psychoeducation, the understanding is about 80% of it. That it's a huge part of it. We park strategies. We'll work that out once the child and those around them understand why they're acting distracted, understand the complexity of that, understand what's in the environment, what's going on in their mind. So that we, once we have that understanding in place, then we can look at ways to support them. So with this approach, it's really a huge part is about the child and adult working together. And I'm going to describe how we did that in a research context within a study with a researcher led, but actually now it's parents and teachers who are leading the way with this. Identifying and understanding the difficulties. And I'm just going to give you an example of why that's so important. I've done research with children with ADHD in particular. That's the kind of the disorder that I've most and longest done research on. And my research has consistently shown that far more of these children have memory difficulties than have attention. And those, even when they have attention and memory, the memory difficulties tend to be much more impactful and affecting what they're doing. So if you're a teacher in a class and you're just looking at how to help the child concentrate and focus their attention, you're potentially missing an awful lot more. So it's really working with the child to identify what are all these thinking skills impacting them. And then helping the child through dialogue. So we use phrases that we repeat like stop and think, and I used a strategy. I thought about my memory. And practicing these. When I say practice, I mean just engaging in activities that makes you think about your memory and how your thinking skills work. And to say then looking at strategies. And sometimes a strategy might just be verbalizing, like we had with one child, my brain is busy at the moment, and being able to articulate that they need a strategy. So with the EPIC approach, with the booklets that we have, we first, we advocate that parents and teachers use understanding resources that we have, whether that's in the booklet or we now have a launch parent platform with more detailed guides, and that we go to strengths. Because if we look at neurodivergent characteristics, taking risks, making quick decisions, what classical characteristics of many children with ADHD, these actually can be good in certain situations. There was a recent study published that showed that when groups had a young person with ADHD in them, the whole group made a quicker decision, and it was good to make a quick decision within that particular context. Of course, we have to harness these because being at the side of the road with a child and taking risks, is not good. But what we want to do with this approach is really identify when those characteristics are positive, because often they can be. And so it's really about trying to identify and really, bolster up the child's esteem, with, for example, strong sense of justice. We can look at being, rigid, being black and white in a negative way, but there are many scenarios in which it can be seen as positive. And then we'll work with the child, and we have the booklets go through activities where you might be working with one child, you could be working with a small group, but we've now developed whole class materials where teachers can teach the whole child and sit with all the children in the class and do this. They're going to be on our website later on this summer. But they look at areas of difficulty, areas we would say to the child, areas that you'd like to work on, areas that you'd like to understand more about yourself. And as I say, really going through quite a lot of different options, because ADHD, for example, is not just about attention. Autism is not just about thinking flexibly. And because of the co-occurrences, there may be many of these that the child wants to work on. And then in our booklets and also in our more detailed resources that are online, we basically explain these concepts, and we co-produce these booklets with parents and teachers so that they would be meaningful to them. And the strategies, so that they're things that the teacher can easily do in the classroom without having to run off and trying to find materials, and certainly without not wanting to have to go and purchase anything. And basically what we're trying to do here is encourage the child to be a mini psychologist, to really intuitively begin to understand them and what's acting as a barrier, why they can't remember an instruction, for example. I say an instruction. Research has shown that the average teacher instruction has 5 parts. And these children are often maybe remembering the first part or remembering the last, or, maybe both, but, forgetting in the middle. And so we wonder why they can't start a task, stay on it and complete it. And the booklets have lots of different, very simple ideas for, helping the child once, you understand what the set of difficulties are. In our more detailed resources, we do lots of activities with children. This is actually one of the examples from our whole class approach, where we talk through some of the examples. And again, this is one of our, inhibition examples, where we're trying to help the child to understand why, something might be, why they might need to work on something. One of their, the characteristics of their condition. A lot of neurodivergent children, not just children with ADHD, are disinhibited. And, there's lots of examples where, this can be, not good for everybody concerned. And one of the examples we have in our resources is, a child, being very disinhibited and wanting to approach a working dog. So we talk through all these examples so the child can understand, examples where it's, more fitting with the environment to be disinhibited, and then examples where where there's an impact and where it doesn't work, and then encouraging them. In this case, we would use the phrase "stop and think," and to try and think in that scenario about what to do, or maybe ask an adult if you're not sure. We do lots of activities like memory games, and again, this is one from our whole class approach. We developed that whole class approach to be just really inclusive, so that all children can do with learning about their memory. And this actually is a memory task. So the teacher or parent or whatever adult is doing with the child want to teach the child about their memory. A brilliant game to do this is the T-Tell games. You just find objects in the class or in the house, and you can group them in some ways. But you don't tell the child that at first, and you child or children, and you encourage them to play the game. And then ask them, did you use any strategies? And then you can show them ways. These could be grouped by function. They could also have been grouped by color. And by doing that, you can talk to the child, have that dialogue. When we do group that, we start thinking about these things a little bit deeper, because you're thinking, well, the toothbrush goes with the soap. And what you're doing there is you're helping the child to understand that we need to rehearse, we need to think deeply about things if we're going to remember them. So really the whole approach is about the adult and the child working together, or as I say, adult and children, because this can be done in groups, and helping the child to understand what the difficulties are, because these children are going around and you're seeing emotional behavioral responses because they don't understand what their difficulties are, and they don't understand how best to express that to the adults around them and how the environment can work for them. And we want to really empower the child so that they identify what support strategies they need in place. And then we can look at a toolkit of strategies that are suitable for them. But of course, what works one day might not work another. and it's about, being flexible. When we first did this, we developed a very typical, as you do when you do a sort of pilot study and you're thinking about, maybe going on to do a big randomized control trial. It was very, very structured. So 2 sessions, this many days apart, one with a child, one with an adult. Initially, we were teacher only, and then we included parents. It would be a certain number of minutes. And what we found was the children who were involved in a program like that, it was for 8 weeks. We had an ADHD group and a comparison group, and the children who took part in the EPIC program improved in cognition, particularly memory. They improved in a wide range of aspects of literacy and parent and teacher rated behaviours. So all great. But actually, when we spoke to parents and teachers, there's a very small proportion of people were able to take part in the study because of, lots of barriers. But actually, when we costed what it would, what you'd have to pay to deliver this, because it was led by the researchers, so lots of staff sessions, and not just the sessions you have with the child, but all the planning sessions around that. It was really, really expensive, and it was never going to be feasible, within the health services. But it was also really not empowering. At this stage, we had our booklets going online, and I had parents and teachers constantly contact me and say, I'm using your booklets, and I'm kind of like doing it in a, kind of program kind of way. Do you have resources that can help me more to do that? Like, I'm just going through your booklet. So out of this came the self-delivery with support program. And we know parents don't just want signposted resources. They want some person time. So what this is all about is basically empowering the parent and the teacher, because we have teacher resources as well, to use the resources to deliver, basically their own program, but they don't necessarily have to do it in a program, because that's what they were telling us. The parents were telling us, I want to integrate this into everyday life. I want to do this at a time that's suitable for me. And the teachers were saying as well, we want to do this when it's accessible to us. And we all know, a bit like going on a diet, when you integrate these things into your daily life, they have a much more likely impact to be successful. Across this stage, I was beginning to think a lot about how I could scale this engagement. And as a researcher in a university, like, most universities who have a significant commercialization centre attached, Edinburgh Innovations, I was encouraged to think about whether this could be set up, in terms of a business. If you wanted to reach more people and reach them in different ways, you're very limited to do that within a sort of research university context. So this is my last slide. We have recently launched Epic Think Learn, and this is basically the research translated, commercialized. I say commercialized, it's a social enterprise, which is a not for personal profit, but there's a lot of myths around that. You actually do have to generate profits in order to be able to reach more parents and reach more teachers. Just a couple of days ago, we opened our parent platform, and that has much more detailed resources behind there. And also we have teacher webinars on there, and we've been running webinars for clinicians and developing materials indeed for clinicians so that they are presented with the latest research. I'm running this and with my partner Iona Benj, but I'm also still an academic and still doing research, and that's really, really important, because the messages that we're getting across are only as good as the latest research studies. I have a couple of studies that we're analysing data on now, for example, on camouflaging, masking, your symptoms and autism and ADHD and other conditions, and we're putting those research findings into outputs back into here, and that's really, really important, because I truly believe that if we're going to understand the condition, be able to support them effectively, knock those poor developmental outcomes on the head and give them equity, give them the best opportunity that we can, it needs to come from a place of understanding and a holistic approach where the parent, clinician and teacher are working together with the child, but based on the latest research, based on what that evidence is telling us will most benefit these young people. Thanks for listening, and I'll stop sharing.
So thanks for that, Valerie. Sinead. very valuable presentation. If people have any questions or comments, I know we're just about 10, 15 minutes. I just think you have to head off about 5:45. So we can see if we can get anything in before that. So if anybody have any questions, if you'd like to pop them into the Q&A, we'll try and do our best to get them for Sinead. But just in the meantime, just one of the things I was just taking notes from the presentation, which is always a good sign. One of the things you were talking about that in terms of, obviously I'm from ADHD Ireland, forgive me for the person interested in the question, is that you were saying that in terms of the learning or academic achievement with children, that it's not the attention deficit, it's the memory. Again, I would have been looking at a survey from the UK, and it was showing that they did a test for children as they went into primary school. They did in 2001, 46,000 children. And what they're saying is that in terms of academic achievement, attention deficit was the biggest driver of challenges. But I can see working memory, and particularly shorter working memory, would have a challenge for children with ADHD. So if you could just maybe expand on how you would see the differences between attention deficit and working memory in learning and academic achievement for children with ADHD and perhaps other neurodiverse conditions.
So you've got to ask yourself, what does it look like to not remember something? When someone is talking to you and they give you a set of instructions, like the teacher's 5-part instruction, and then you don't go to start the task, it looks like you're not paying attention. And even when we measure this discreetly, are you ever really separating out these things? I'm not saying that attention isn't important in ADHD, okay? What I'm saying is that memory is even more important, and they're important together. So it's not actually knocking it on its head. And I wouldn't be saying, like, let's replace the attention with memory, for example. It's much more broad than that. And it's actually, in 25 minutes, I haven't had enough time to go through. Actually, what we find with kids with ADHD is that it's the broader aspects. And unfortunately, some of the broader aspects that stimulants don't work on, so I've done a lot of work, including RCTs, on stimulant medication. It's the things like planning, timing, regulating yourself to a task. Well, that is improved by medication, but planning and timing, working out like what time should you use a task, their perception of time. There's a lot of temporal timing difficulties in ADHD. So a lot of these broader aspects, but actually this really applies to autism. So there's a really interesting study published recently, lead author Lorcan Kenny, with autistic young people, and they asked the young people and their parents what cognitive difficulties they found were actually impacting them. And the autistic young kids, and only one had ADHD, but a lot will have co-occurring symptoms, they just won't have diagnosed. They were all mentioning these broader aspects that actually, what was impacting their lives were, the sort of broader aspects. So I'm not saying that attention isn't important, but for any child, there's usually, multiple aspects related. And I think often when we talk about attention, or actually even memory, we may be talking about, the opposite, or, we're talking about them together, because it's it's impossible to actually separate them.
So within that, I mean, are you seeing that those, sorry, forgive me, in terms of looking at children that would be neurodiverse, we're looking at autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, is there any sort of common learning challenges across the conditions, are all individually looked at or treated?
Well, dyslexia is slightly different because it's a specific learning difficulty. Yeah. And it very commonly co-occurs with ADHD. So in some ways it's not different because a lot of those kids have ADHD as well. But the approach that we're taking, this is not psychoeducation about autism or psychoeducation about ADHD. This is psychoeducation about your functions, your thinking skills, what that looks like. So how you remember something. If you're good at maybe remembering in the long term, but not in the short term, or a certain type of short-term memory, whether you plan out something, whether you rehearse information, whether you consciously use a strategy, like, because younger children don't, but then older children just naturally do it, and then a lot of kids are neurodivergent. It's not that they maybe have a memory difficulty, they just forget to do it. Sensory. So a lot of kids with ADHD, we think it's a cognitive thing, and well, it is, but a lot it's being exacerbated by they can't take themselves away from that clicking pen that's going on beside them because they have some autism or some sensory difficulties. And dyspraxia is very much, that's a case for where there's sensory difficulties. So we're basically not looking at the disorder. We're looking at what does this look like for the child, because these are so co-occurring, like 50% ADHD and autism. We know that from a big systematic review that we did. So, there's lots of reasons why you would want to look at a disorder, in terms of identity, in terms of medication, but actually in terms of function, the research is suggesting it's better to take a neurodivergent approach.
Within that, then, just in terms of working with children, I know you mentioned it a couple of times throughout the presentation, in terms of goals, rewards, maybe even sanctions. How would that fit into sort of a strengths-based approach for educating people with those types of conditions?
Yeah, so we don't do rewards as such, because we're really, 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 because I do a lot of masking research, which is absolutely hot telling us, it's linked to depression. So we're really not rewarding or sanctioning. What we're doing, so you have a child who's moving around the classroom, and this isn't optimal, but it's about actually taking time beforehand to identify, right, that child is going to need to move in that class. How can we best do that? Could that be the child who goes and collects the milk? If that child asks to go to the toilet, and you kind of know that they don't need to go to the toilet because they went to the last one, do they actually need to go because they just need to move? Just let them go to the toilet. Right. Often teachers will say to me, oh, it's very, very disruptive. Well, you don't do it, and they spend 95% of the time trying to move. And then you see this emotional and behavioral response. So we're definitely, rewards and sanctions aren't part of this. It's actually about embracing the child's difficulties, not with a reward, not with a sanction, embracing them, but not disregarding, we don't talk about differences. So with some children that can apply to, but we are head on saying, these children have difficulties, but we're doing it in a positive way. We're saying, identifying your difficulties is an opportunity to better understand and support you. It's a positive thing.
Well, thanks for that. Just a question just come in there in the chat from Katie. Do you think that depression and anxiety can compound memory issues for neurodivergent people? I've been told that cognitive behavior therapy often doesn't work for treating people with depression for neurodivergence. Could this be part of the reason?
So I'm not an expert at all on CBT, but in terms of mental health, I've done a lot of research on that. This is really, really tricky. We know that children across those neurodivergent conditions, all three of the ones that I've mentioned, have a 50% chance of developing depression and anxiety, and while still a child. One of the difficulties, though, in terms of the point that's just been made, is there's a lot of overlap between the symptoms. So if you fill out a regular depression questionnaire, you're going to be asked about if you had difficulties in focusing, and if you have difficulties in completing your schoolwork, if you're a child, for example. So it's quite difficult to disentangle the two, but we really do need to understand both and look to see and to know. So I do a lot of webinars with clinicians where they know there's a high rate of co-occurrence, but they don't all necessarily know that research has shown that it's such early onset in terms of, if you measured it, because often we don't measure it that early on. And I'm talking about early primary school years. So it's really important as something that, that's just considered, that's looked at from very early on.
Just for myself, another quick question, just based on your presentation. And you were talking about there that in terms of, it's one of the things we say when we're doing presentation ourselves, in terms of supporting a child with ADHD, it's generally 3 people, 2 parents and 1 teacher. And so again, in terms of, you mentioned that you develop resources for teachers and for parents to help to support the child. Could you maybe just give a bit more information on those?
So we have the free booklets. So we have booklets that are pretty much identical, whether you're a parent or teacher, but it just describes them in different, the different settings and different words. And then in terms of the Epic Think Learn platform that's just gone live, we've got a parent platform that parents can subscribe to. We're obviously, I'm talking to NHS services. Our goal is that they'll pay as a child joins a waiting list for the parent. But basically, there's a lot more detailed resources there. There's videos with child actors, actually doing the activities. And we really listen to parents. So a lot of parents that we work with, have dyslexia, for example, and said, your booklets are great, but I don't want to read a booklet. So we've recorded everything. So we've got videos. we've got webinars going on there, but also a Q&A support. So every time they're on the website and they're reading something, there's a thing in the corner with, send us your question. And then twice a week we have a Q&A support. So they come and they see us. They get to see us. And that was really, really important, because we know from our work that parents don't just want to access resources. They want to know that they could ask a question that kind of more relates to their own scenario. And so we can pool them and put them together. And then in terms of the schools, at the moment we have webinars online, but as I mentioned, these whole class materials, they'll go on our site later in the summer.
Did Valerie have any questions in the Q&A?
Yes, I can see there's a question in from Laura. I think you might have touched on this already, Sinead, but Laura asks, would it be fair to say that working memory and attention deficit are intrinsically linked, and that the failure of the memory is down to attention deficit? And she also goes on to say that one of her children has a challenge, that they were focusing on trying to mask tics because of TS. I'm making an assumption that's Tourette's, right, and take in what the teacher is saying, as well as having an impaired memory function. So the brain must have been running on fast forward, but the outcome was subpar. So this is coming in from Laura. So working memory and attention deficit intrinsically linked, and failure of the memory is down to attention deficit. Is that fair to say?
No. So, because I've done research on that. We did a research, and I've done this countless times, because it was a really neat finding. It was really important because it addresses this exactly. We did a study, and we used a set of tasks from what's called the Cantab battery. We use these because we know they're, what parts of the brain they're linked with on those kind of imaging studies, but they're done on an iPad, and they're like games. And children quite like doing them. But one of them, the pattern comes up on the screen and then disappears, and then 4 patterns appear, one of which is the same. Three others are distractors. They get to choose the pattern, which was the identical one, either straight away or they have to wait. And what we saw was that when they were able to choose it straight away, the children with ADHD were exactly like their peers. So they had attended, they had encoded, they had paid attention, but the more of the delay that they had, the worse they were impairment, what we call delay dependent impairment. So the more they had to wait, that information was disappearing. When you talk to children with ADHD, they describe that. Yeah, it was in my head, but it just disappeared. So for a lot of children, there's a memory decay issue. Memory is the information is disappearing quicker. But of course, remember what I said about a lot of these children, like younger children, just forget to use the strategy. So, and that could be, I guess, where they're distracted, and this is where attention and memory start linking back up together. But a lot of the work we do with kids with ADHD is around remember to use the strategy, because they just don't think to do it.
Okay, that's great, Sinead. Thanks a million. There's another question in the chat from Anna. She asks, is this subscription based for schools too? This is such a good resource, but I fear that it is not something that many schools can afford to invest in. Therefore, children will miss out and problems confounded. And she says she is a teacher herself.
Absolutely. So we have online that we will launch a school service, I think later in the year, next year. Increasingly, we're not focusing on that for this very issue. So we're a social enterprise. This is just to cover basic costs of running the whole thing. So what we've done is we've put up webinars for schools, and they're run on we're based in Scotland. They're run on the Scottish in-service days that are actually in August, which is a bit weird, but they're recorded. And for a whole school, the whole school can pay, it's £199 for a whole morning. Like it basically almost 3 hours of webinars. So that is basically, depending on the size of your school, very small amount, and we've tried to do it that way. We've basically developed services around the fact that schools, parents, don't have the money. I know Ireland is very similar. I visit Ireland all the time. I know you're in a scenario to us. So everything that we have done is built on that. And for example, our parent subscribers is supported by a grant, so they pay half the money if it's an individual parent in an organisation. And I say again, the money that we charge is purely just to pay to to be able to do it, and wherever we can. When we receive donations and grants, we're straight on with developing free resources and putting them on.
Fantastic, Sinead. Thank you.
Yeah.
But it should be feasible for schools. So £200 for a half-day webinars for a whole school. If you think about how many teachers can watch that in a whole school, it should be feasible. We've done a lot of work with what people can afford to pay, and then try to develop things around that.
And if I can maybe just, I know you have to run off in 2 minutes, so just maybe one last question just to wrap up. Forgive me, but it sounds like an Irish accent to me, but you're from the University of Edinburgh. Next week there's an election in the UK. You're running for Prime Minister, you win the election on June the 5th or July the 5th. What are you doing to improve the situation? So at the very start, as you said, children with neurodevelopmental conditions are getting 2 GCSEs compared to 7. So how are we going to, not say completely, but radically change the education system so that those type of things don't happen anymore?
So I would absolutely categorically say that as a child joins a waiting list, because we're not going to change the waiting list anytime soon, they're increasing. As a child joins a waiting list, that the health service and or educational service invest what is actually a very small amount of money in that child at that point for either Epic Think Learn or something similar, supporting them, from the point the needs are first identified. Absolutely, to improve those outcomes, to give them equity of opportunity, they need to be provided with that support. It's not just about improving academics and learning, because people often ask me that, oh, did they improve in the maths, did they improve in this? It's about them enjoying school, being able to want to go to school, wanting to stay in school. These are fundamental priorities, and everything we're doing is focused as much as that on the learning, because it's about embracing the child's neurodivergence, doing this whole class approach where the other children in the class understand the neurodivergence, and you take that stigma away, then they can stop masking and hiding their symptoms, and they feel supported, they want to go.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. That brings us nicely to the end of the webinar for today. So I just say I'd like to thank Sinead. As I say, we will be recording this talk, and it will be available to you very shortly. So again, I'd like to say, just because this is where we have our break for the summer period, so I'd just like to say thanks to Sinead and all the other speakers we've had across the year. Thanks to Valerie for pressing all the buttons behind the scene. And just to let you know, we will be back in September. So again, hope you all have a great July, August, and we look forward to seeing you again and in the autumn.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good summer.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sinead.
Bye.